I am your guest host, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. And I've been doing a lot of reading lately into Huxley's works. You know, we just covered last fourth hour that I hosted a couple weeks ago, Brave New World. I read another one of Huxley's books this week. This week I read The Doors of Perception. And this is a fascinating text because it's one of the early texts that really popularized, far before the 1960s counterculture revolution, the idea of experimentation with hallucinogens, not just for breakthrough experiences in terms of consciousness and creativity, but for breakthrough experiences in a religious way. And so the Doors of Perception, as you may know, that would be the basis for the rock band The Doors, Jim Morrison's The Doors, to title their band. And also, if you didn't know, Jim Morrison and The Doors, they come out of a scene called the Laurel Canyon scene. The Laurel Canyon scene was, in my view, a heavily influenced and co-opted scene. In other words, it had a lot of deep state military intelligence background to it. And in my view, it's one of the key elements that we can look to see that the counterculture is something engineered and co-opted. And we're going to be looking at that today because when Huxley wrote The Doors of Perception, he wrote this in 1954. So this is, several years before the 1960s and even the Laurel Canyon scene, far before that in terms of the Haight-Ashbury district, when we typically think of the beginning of the 1960s counterculture. By the way, if you didn't know, Jim Morrison's dad was Admiral Morrison, who was involved in the Gulf of Tonkin accident, which was a false flag, one of the most famous false flags, and that was his dad. There's some weird things about Jim Morrison. Did you know that he went through a blood drinking witchcraft initiation when he was dating a witch at one point? That's actually in the Oliver Stone film with Val Kilmer. Great film. And they actually include that scene if you've never seen it. I recommend you go and watch it. But the Doors of Perception deals with a trip that he took to Hollywood. And I didn't actually know, because I'd not yet read this book. It's famous. I'd heard of it, but I'd never gotten through it until recently. And he talks about that he took this trip to Hollywood in the 1950s for an American Psychiatric Association meeting. And while he was at that at the hotel and hanging out in the Hollywood area, he decided to try mescaline. And so he recorded the experience and wrote down a lot of his ideas as a result of this. And this becomes the book, The Doors of Perception. It also comes from a William Blake title about cleansing the doors of perception, which deals with the artist's perception of true reality and true being and inspiration and creativity. Now, if you don't know, of course, William Blake was very influenced by Hermeticism and alchemy, and he includes a lot of that in his paintings and in his poetry. And so that's where Huxley is pulling from. But the reason this is so important is not because of wannabe shamans out there and brujos and people that want to go to Peru and, yeah, I want to go be a shaman in Peru, man, and go on a vision quest. That's not the point. The point is that this would become part of MK Ultra. This was a key element, a key time period when MK Ultra was just kicking off. And as you know, MK Ultra comes out of the Tavistock and British versions of shell shock experimentation and mind control. Now, on my channel, if you go to YouTube, I just lectured through the first half of Dr. John Coleman's very rare, very hard to get Tavistock book. In the past, we've covered Daniel Estelin's Tavistock book. This is a different Tavistock book. This is one of the first written on Tavistock in the year 2005. And at that time, that was right before, I think, Dr. John Coleman passed away, the purported MI5, MI6 whistleblower who went into the details of how British intelligence was really behind the 60s counterculture and a lot of this stuff. We're going to find a lot of overlap. And he speaks heavily of the Fabian socialists. And I'm going to make that tie-in and get into some of that work. But a key figure in this this architecture from Tavistock and the Esalen Institute is the figure of Huxley. And Huxley is crucial for the popularization and the mass initiation through the counterculture drug culture of LSD and all of the other hallucinogens. So we're going to get to that in a moment. Don't go anywhere. This is the Aldous, and I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. Support is in the store right now. Welcome back. I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis, and we are talking about other texts that Aldous Huxley wrote, one of those key formative figures preparing the way for the mass initiation that would occur in the 1960s and up until today, bringing us into the phase of the final revolution that Aldous and his brother Julian wrote about. Julian has a book about the final revolution. Aldous writes about the final revolution in many, many places. Of course, we know Brave New World, the dystopian novel that we covered 2 weeks ago in the 4th hour, deals with the mass drugging of the population, and they're being initiated into a kind of weird new world religion of sex, magic, drugs, and orgies. That's in the novel. And we're already kind of on the cusp of that now. All of the weird inversions that you see and everything going crazy in society, it's not primarily something that's just an organic revolution or counterculture revolution. All the counterculture stuff, especially of the 20th century and today, is largely manufactured, created, and steered by social engineers, particularly the premier engine of which is the Tavistock Institute, the Tavistock Clinic. Where does this come from? Well, you've heard of Edward Bernays' classic book, Propaganda. And on my channel, of course, as you know, we lecture through dozens of these global elite texts, and we've done it for years now, going on 6-7 years. We've been through probably 60 now, maybe 70 white papers, key texts of the elite. And we did Bernays' Propaganda many years ago. And if you recall, there's a curious statement on the very first page. Do you remember what it is? The famous quote. He says, "We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes are formed, all of our ideas are suggested largely by men that we have never heard of. But it is the logical result of the way in which this democratic society, it's a fraud, democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this if they're to live together. Our invisible governors are unaware, we are unaware of their identity and this leadership." He says that they control through social engineering. It is a conscious manipulation, he says, by intelligent individuals to control this democratic society. They constitute an invisible government, and that is the true ruling power of this country. He's talking about America, Edward Bernays, father of modern propaganda, advertising, all that, relative of Sigmund Freud. Do you know what institution he's talking about? He's talking about the Tavistock Institute. Why is that so important? Where does that come from? Who cooked this up? Well, guess what? It's cooked up by all the same Fabian socialists that I've lectured on for the last 6 months, a year. The Lord Milner, the Lord Rothschild, the Cecil Rhodes circles. They came up with the Tavistock Clinic, the Tavistock Institute. And what's the history of this? Well, around the time of World War I, there was an institution founded by British intelligence at that time, known as Wellington House. And Wellington House was creative in its propaganda, right before World War I. They were really part of getting the US involved in World War I. And one of the ways they did was that they came up with a weaponized term called isolationist. You remember this was used when Ron Paul was running back in the day. Oh, Ron Paul's an isolationist. He doesn't want us involved in foreign entanglements. That's the classical American decentralized approach of states' rights, right? That's the classic American approach. Decentralization, we don't want a giant federal government that tells us we have to be involved in every European foreign conflict. Now, the World War I and World War II events themselves were the means by which this secret inner core that Bernays is talking about out of Tavistock, run by British intelligence, that was the means by which they got the United States into global policing and the vehicle for global governance. And that's what Dr. Carroll Quigley writes about in his gigantic tome, Tragedy and Hope. But the means that they used to achieve this were the perfecting of the scientific technique of social engineering, social control, and public opinion making. One of the early Tavistock luminaries was Walter Lippmann, who wrote the famous book in, I think, 1920, Public Opinion. Just like this book, Propaganda. And so they perfected the technique at Wellington House of coming up with weaponized terms that were then used by the Woodrow Wilson administration because he was an agent of these people. He had a handler called Colonel Edwin Mandell House. And that's how the Federal Reserve and all of that got pushed and set up. That's how there was the 14 freedoms and the idea that America would now be an engine for these people, Tavistock and the Fabians and the Royal Society. They wrote at this time the idea that America could be a that there should be a manifesto of justice. And this was something that Woodrow Wilson put forward. You can almost see the beginnings of social justice warriors here with Woodrow Wilson, maybe. And they came up with the idea of demonizing the Kaiser for World War I and why we needed to be involved in World War I. And they called him the butcher. Guess what? They used the exact same propaganda for Saddam, the butcher of Baghdad. Same propaganda. Putin is Hitler, even though Russia fought Nazis. Putin is Hitler. Okay. So Wellington House, this intelligence wartime warfare apparatus around World War I that influences Woodrow Wilson and the American structure, it evolves into the Tavistock Clinic, the Tavistock Institute for Social Engineering. And it evolved out of the 1936 text by Oswald Spengler. Now, I'm not saying Spengler was involved in this, but the British intelligentsia read Spengler, the famous theorist of history who theorized that history and its empires have civilizational cycles. Civilizations have a birth, an ascent, an apogee, and then a decline and a collapse. And then it gives way to a new form, a new civilization. And you can never repeat the old civilizations. There's always a new form. And so Spengler's Decline of the West, which was his theory about how, as a result of the past patterns of history, Western civilization would collapse and decline. They read that, these Wellington House strategists like Arnold Toynbee and others, and they said, hey, we could actually weaponize that. Let's take the track of how Spengler describes the decline, and let's weaponize it and turn it into an actual way to accelerate the decline and collapse of Western civilization. Because, as we've said, the Tavistock social engineers and the Fabian socialists behind all this already had in place that at that time, back then, the technocratic government that they wanted to bring in, the global technocracy. In fact, Lord Halford Mackinder, the famous British theorist of heartland theory, rimland theory, which we've lectured on many times. Lord Halford Mackinder said, we must have global governance now at all costs, no matter what. Even if it was required a socialist dictatorship, we will have it, no matter what. And he wrote about that and theorized and strategized that in the 1920s and 30s, way, way early on, together with Toynbee and H.G. Wells and all the same characters you always hear me talk about, because all of these people wrote books and it's all public. But another thing they wanted to do was study how to master perception management, perception control. Don Draper, Mad Men, same stuff, because the same people behind that show, or what that show's about, the Mad Men, the admin, that's talking about these people. Lippmann, Bernays, these people. How do we make public opinion? Well, one way they figured out how to make it and to master it was through wartime operations, wartime psychological operations. Not just against the enemy, but how to get the people in the homeland, your people, the West, on board with all of the wars and the entanglements. Simplest way to do it, create a villain. Saddam's the butcher of Baghdad. Osama bin Laden. Right within a few minutes of the World Trade Center towers. Osama bin Laden. We must invade Afghanistan. Right, stuff that had nothing to do with 9/11. It becomes the pretext for everything else, all of the global imperium and the loss of liberties, et cetera, et cetera. That's all mastered at Tavistock and Rand Corporation. A lot of the Tavistock people also worked at the Rand Corporation. Cross-pollination. Dr. Kurt Lewin spent time at MIT, spent time doing stuff at Rand, one of the famous Tavistock guys. This is the Don't Go Anywhere. I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis, and go get those products now. Guest host Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. We're talking about the seminal text of the 1960s Counterculture from 1954 from Tavistock and British intelligence operative in my view, Aldous Huxley, The Doors of Perception, and how Huxley was crucial in kicking off the drug revolution and the drug experimentation of the 1960s. In fact, there's a lot of references throughout this book to all kinds of things that you wouldn't necessarily expect. He not only references all kinds of religious traditions and a kind of a syncretist blending of all the religions, he says that mescaline might be the key by which, and perhaps future iterations of these entheogens, turning them into things like LSD, right? They might be the key by which humans as a whole could achieve initiation. And he never really says exactly what into what. He just talks about initiation into the pure vision, into the vision of the light, into perhaps he means something Luciferian. In fact, at one point he mentions Luciferianism in this novel. He also mentions adrenochrome in the first 3 or 4 pages, by the way. But he talks about the perceiver who is initiated through, in this case, the mescaline or any other kind of hallucinogen like this. He says that these things without pretensions are satisfied to be merely themselves. They are sufficient in their suchness. He uses these really generic, deep sounding terms instead of being or existence. He'll say the suchness, not acting as a part to go it alone in isolation, in Luciferian defiance of the grace of God. He says that individuality is Luciferian, and we see the wholeness. Everything becomes one, monism, pantheism. And in fact, at one point he even says that when you do these drugs, you see your own potentiality to be omniscient. So this kind of delusion that he has divine powers and divine insight, he can potentially know and see all things, which is literally what he says, leads him towards the end of the book to say that if you think about the religious mystics of the past and their experiences, and we look at things like the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is something that his other intelligence cohort, Tim Leary, was a big fan of. We'll talk about that in a second. He says that there's a pure vision of light that one sees in these books and in these drugs. And that pure light, which we're reminded, of course, that Lucifer can appear as an angel of light. He says that pure light that can be seen is something that perhaps the state should even mandate people go through. He said, I'm not joking. He says, maybe we ought to even have state mandated drug trips. Well, that sounds a lot like what's in Brave New World. So again, you thought he was exposing, no, he's exposing the Brave New World dystopia. He's a hero of freedom. No, he says that we should have mandated drug trips that he says, are for those that we call the angels. I don't know. He says Blake's angels. I think he means the artistic and creative and genius elites of society should undergo mandatory drug trips. And by the way, he quotes H.G. Wells countless times throughout the novel. In fact, the doors in the wall is a phrase he uses from H.G. Wells, consummate globalist, socialist, Fabian, etc. Because maybe we should even mandate this. And he says that when we look at the religious landscape of America, he says that the traditional religions are dead and they're boring and they're calcified and they're stultified and all this kind of stuff, which, okay, that might be true, but he says the answer to this is to have a new religion, something like Native American religion, something like we see Mickey and Mallory doing in Natural Born Killers. I'm not joking, he actually says that. He says we have to have a new kind of world religion where we all just trip balls. We're tripping balls, man. That's the new world religion. Now, where did he come up with this? Is he just an organic, random thinker, some cool, hip guy? No, he was hanging out and partying with none other than the beast, Aleister Crowley. Yes, according to Dr. Richard Spence, Crowley and Huxley partied together, did drugs together, hung out, because both were serving British intelligence. Of course, Crowley was an agent of MI5, kind of a provocateur. And this is not unique to Huxley. Huxley is just one of the first to talk about this. If we move on and we look at books like The Psychedelic Experience, Timothy Leary says that this could be a guide, right, to initiate the masses or to initiate people into understanding and seeing the pure light. But it's not, of course, anything to do with God, Western civilization's idea of the Bible, and it's nothing like that. This is the new, unknown, secret, hidden God of the esotericists and of the occultists. And that's explicitly what Leary says in that book. Now, where does all of this come from? This idea of utilizing drug trips and whatnot. Well, guess what? That's what the British Empire was so good at. There's a famous book on this. Have you heard of it? It's called Dope Inc. It's about how Britain, prior to the 20th century, ran a giant worldwide opium operation. And it was, guess what? It wasn't just making money. Drugs as means of control, drugs as social control. So when Aleister Crowley was doing his occult drug trip experiences, and he wrote a book called The Drug Diaries, and then Huxley read these books, and then they read each other's books. Huxley and his social engineer crews realized that these are great means for social control. So even if you don't believe in the demonic or demons or spirits or any of that, drugs are a key tool for social control, according to the social engineers themselves. And so that is why they saw such a power in the promotion of the sexual revolution and the drug revolution in the 1960s, and why all of these people promoted it years, decades before it happened. Did you know that in the 1920s and 30s, there was a mini sexual revolution? Not just in the US, not just in America during the decadence of the period that, F. Scott Fitzgerald writes about in Great Gatsby, and we read about it in, or if you've seen the modern German TV series Babylon Berlin by Tom Tykwer, right? That's taking place during the degeneracy of the pre-Weimar, the Weimar Republic, the Berlin era, right before World War II. And then we had this, stock market crash and all that, which was engineered by the elite, by the way. Well, that was a period of intense Skittles stuff, TRANS stuff, the trans stuff was going on. All of that was going on in the 1920s and 30s, and these people at Tavistock studied it. They studied the It Girl, Clara Bow, Joan Crawford, Louise Brooks, how that could steer the youth and the culture. They want to be like the It Girl who cut her hair, bobbed it, was wild, slept around, all that kind of stuff. They knew in the 20s and 30s that this could all be weaponized as culture creation. And all of these books talk about it. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's admin and social engineers and psychiatrists and psychologists. In fact, Huxley was going to the American Psychiatric Association meeting when he went and was tripping mescaline in Hollywood and partying. And I'm not trying to be a Puritan as if like, oh, every drug is bad and I'm a good person because I don't drink alcohol. I'm not being a teetotaler. That's not the point here. The point is that all this stuff is studied for social control. I'm sure there are real medical applications of everything that exists. Everything that exists, God gave us. But it's also weaponizable, and that's what we're talking about today. Don't go anywhere. jaysanalysis.com. You can also follow me on Twitter and all the other social media outlets under Jay Dyer. I would ask that you do that. Of course, we don't get a lot of algorithmic promotion on. We do well on Twitter, but if you go over to YouTube and you find my channel, go ahead and support and share that stuff, like that stuff, because of course the algorithm doesn't promote the stuff that we talk about typically because it's pretty edgy. But I'm going to be doing a deeper dive into a lot of this Huxley stuff on my YouTube channel as well. So if you want to go follow me there, you can. We'll be doing that later today. But we're talking about the doors of perception. We're talking about how Huxley was beginning to see at this time the potentiality for using drugs and using the older model of British imperial control, the opium model, the opium war, for a new way to revolutionize society. And it wasn't just about the individual going on a vision quest and figuring out his inner demons and his own little journey or whatever. No, this is a way to control and steer society, and he talks about it that way. And every one of the psychonauts after him talks about it that way, like Terence McKenna.
Oh, Terence McKenna and the food of the gods, he says. We should go back to a Mother Earth Gaia religion.
Right. And it should be based around the mushroom. And so what's amazing is that technocracy has for 100 years, if you read books like Patrick Wood's Technocracy Rising, has seen the power of drugs. And that's for controlling society. That's exactly what is in Brave New World. You understand, when he wrote that, he knew that the fake world religion would be combined with drugs to control society. And he didn't get that from himself. In fact, before him, in 1917, an old rare book, look at this old rare book from H.G. Wells, God the Invisible King. Not talking about the God that you think of, not Jesus, not the Trinity, not any of that. What God is he talking about? The hidden God that you can only see when the doors of perception are open, when your doors of perception are cleansed via counter initiation. Then you see the true God is Lucifer. That's what H.G. Wells said. He says, I'm not an atheist. I follow God. It's just a God called Lucifer, the light bringer, the light bearer. The pure light that he talks about seeing in this book, and the pure light that Tim Leary says you will see in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, because the Tibetan Book of the Dead, he says, is the same journey, the same vision quest that the individual sees when they do the drug trip, when you do the LSD trip, the mescaline trip. It's just like the after-death journey. And that's why throughout this book, Huxley says it's like opening up the multiverse, dude. Now, wait a minute. Are we supposed to believe in science? Or are we back to religious superstition and metaphysics and the multiverse, man? Because the multiverse is like Marvel comic book type stuff. Doesn't seem very scientific, seems very superstitious. Quantum foam, man. But you see, that's why it's a new religion. Because scientism combines very well. Scientism is a kind of a religion. It combines very well with this new age spirituality that these guys were promoting even in the 1890s with the Fabian Socialists and Madame Blavatsky, again, working at the behest of the British Empire. And so they were studying the drug trips, the drug journey, the vision quest, all this stuff was being studied. And in the US, who did Huxley go work very closely with? The Esalen Institute, the US-based brains behind the 1960s counterculture spiritual revolution and spiritual movement and the New Age movement, which would then be kicked off as the counterculture sexual revolution, drugs revolution, which we could never be where we are today with the biological revolutions that you can identify as whatever you want without Tavistock. So who's in the background all the way back to World War I and the Fabian Socialists back then? Who's in the background of not the war itself, but managing the public perception? Tavistock. Tavistock is there at World War I. It's there at World War II. It's there in the Cold War. It's there throughout the 60s countercultural revolution. And what was Tavistock so heavily pushing in the last 5 years? The trans agenda. Openly. In fact, they were being sued, I don't know what the result was, by 1,000 families in the UK for transitioning and pushing this on kids. That's the ideological source of the trans agenda. The corporations are pushing it because corporations get their studies and their R&D from Tavistock and Rand Corporation and MIT. The same place puts out the ideology and the studies and the research for how to change identity. Guess who came up with the plan of changing identity, changing images of man? Tavistock, Dr. Kurt Lewin. Changing identity is a Tavistock creation. Now, I know that existed in the past, that there have been people born, with both parts, there've been, I know all that. But it was never in history scientifically engineered and weaponized as it has been by design by the same institutes and the same people that I'm talking about. John Rawlings Rees is another crucial British intelligence character who would go on to work at Tavistock to push all kinds of ideas like this. All of these Fabian socialists, all of these Royal Society elites They're pushing the exact same thing, and they have been. And Rees came up with some fascinating things. One of these was this idea of how do we change America back into this kind of attaché of an inner core of British intelligence elite? It's not going to be done overnight. We're not going to be able to do it right away. We can't install a dictator. He says we're going to use this Fabian model of slow kill, but he said it's a new term. I'm going to key. It's called long range penetration. Long range penetration. And what that means is that you utilize the society's ideology itself and you gradually change it through future shocks. That's a Tavistock idea. So when Alvin Toffler was writing about that and talking about that in the 70s, he was getting that from Tavistock. What are future shocks? Future shocks are changes that are so disruptive to society, so quick, so many of them, so extreme, that the public goes into a kind of panic. The term they use is maladaptive response, passive maladaption, panic, fragmentation, and dissociation. So the way that they would study the trauma-based mind control on an individual, put the individual into a panic crisis mode, he fragments on an individual level his relationships, his psyche, and then he dissociates into fantasy worlds. That can be done on a macro scale for the whole society. Crisis response model, they call it. Contrived crises are steered in the direction that was the original intended goal the whole time. Strategy of tension. Exactly what Brzezinski said about Gladio. Exactly what Kissinger and those guys engineered Gladio operations to do. Strategy of tension, cause the chaos, steer the society to the end goal that was always the plan. Manage crises. Do you think the last 3 years was not a Tavistock managed crises? Of course it was. Admittedly, the Canadian government admits they use psyops to trick you and scare you into this. Welcome back. We're talking about the planned mass initiation ritual, initiating the masses into a new religion via not individual drug trips per se, but via the control and dominance of Big Pharma. Big Pharma now has its octopus grip on top of the population in a similar way to the British Empire. So I'm not saying the British Empire is controlling everybody. No. The inner core elite groups that were running the British Empire, the steering committees, the Royal Society, Royal Institute for International Affairs, Fabian Socialists, et cetera, that clique set up the model for putting Pratt House in New York based on Chatham House in the UK, the secret inner elite that run everything. That's the model. Comes out of the Republic of Plato. Comes out of Plato's later laws, the Council of Night, which is a secret intelligence apparatus of oligarchs that run the country with a bunch of front goobers as their public face of politicians that take the heat, the Bidens, the AOCs. Meanwhile, the deep state, the shadow state, the cryptocracy is who really runs things. And everybody's energy, everybody's focus, everybody's anger is always directed at the public goobers who are meant to be goobers, but never, ever focusing on the Brzezinskis, the Kissingers, the Jacques Attalys, the Dr. Kurt Lewins, the John Rawling Rees of Tavistock. As propaganda itself said, Bernays' book said, 99% of you don't even know these people. That's who's really calling the shots. The real ballers and shot callers are not AOC and Biden. These people call the shots because they utilize long-range penetration to set up organizations and using the quadrillions of fiat money that they printed to buy up everything. It's an amazing scam, an amazing trick. A Tavistock said, the best way to condition the public is to put our guys at Esalen, National Institute of Health, MIT, et cetera, and get them to steer by being intelligentsia, by being in control, get them to initiate people, get them to indoctrinate people. For example, at the National Training Laboratory that was set up on the Avril Harriman property, this National Training Laboratory would set up an invisible army, an invisible college, an invisible army, what Bernays said, it would be the true rulers and controllers of society. So the generals, the CEOs, the government officials, they're sent and trained at places like the National Training Laboratories. What are they trained in? They're trained in the techniques of Dr. Kurt Lewin's, not just the three-system response that we talked about, the three-system response model, but they're trained in behavioral psychology, public manipulation. Keynesian economics, Fabianism. A couple of other characters, Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, key operatives of this power structure of Tavistock. And some of the things that they pushed would also be pushed by Huxley and others, which is the idea of indigenous traditions are magically more spiritual and superior to everything else, right? If you're rolling around in mud and feces, that's way more spiritual, right? Obviously, a guru rolling around in feces is way more spiritual than building giant cathedrals. Totally, obviously. The archaic revival, the shamanic traditions, all of that being pushed is not done organically. There are individuals who organically get into it, sure. But it is pushed from behind the scenes by these people, Tavistock, Rand, Esalen, and dozens, hundreds of other think tanks, foundations, and NGOs that push all of these things. The Ford Foundation, the Soros Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Endowment, Brookings Institute, the CFR, on and on and on and on and on. That's the real power structure, and it's in all of your faces. It's not Joe Biden. Is anybody going to wake up to this? Everybody's talking about this or that conservative talk person who's divorced. None of that matters. This is what's really going on. These are the people that really run you. And because you talk about divorces and nonsense, that's why these people think they have the right to rule you. You don't know who these people are. You don't know who Kurt Lewin is. You don't know what Tavistock is. Now, this audience knows, but I'm saying in general, speaking to a more general sense. You don't know what they're teaching at the Wharton Business School, whether they're teaching Fabian Keynesian economics, do you? Do you know about that? Do you know that John Maynard Keynes was a Fabian socialist? Do you know that Lord Grey was the architect of World War I through Wellington House, which was the predecessor to Tavistock? Do you know that Bertrand Russell supported the sexual revolution back in the 20s and 30s, the pre-sexual revolution I was telling you about, and that all these people studied it to weaponize it? Did you know about Dr. Emery's passive maladaptation phases to controlling and steering society? Stanford Research Institute putting out Changing Images of Man, written by these people. Stanford Research Institute is a Tavistock Institute in America. Not only did they push, it's all the rainbow skills stuff is these people. You understand? It's not an organic revolution of liberties and freedoms. It's steered, controlled, and engineered to control you. To control you through base desires, through your passions. And I mean, we're all, I think it's a fallen world, so we're all going to be subject to this to a degree. But the way to get out of it is not more liberalism, more, give us more liberalism, vote out the scoundrels, put in a new crop of scoundrels, vote in more scoundrels, and let's yell at them. Then we'll vote in some more scoundrels. That's what Quigley says. Quigley says the system was set up so that you would yell at one crop of scoundrels and vote in the new ones. It's a scam. I'm not saying that you can't be involved in politics. I'm just saying that all this stuff's created. The pop stars, they studied this in the 20s and 30s, how to create the it girl. Paris Hilton wasn't the first it girl. Goes back to the 20s and 30s, which at that time, by the way, there were no, if you watch the Brad Pitt, Margot Robbie movie Babylon, which I do recommend watching, it's actually a good portrayal of like what all of that pop culture, Hollywood culture is. Go watch Babylon and you'll see its rise and its descent. And it takes place, by the way, during that period in 1910, 1920s, when there were no controls, like there were no Hays Code, there were no moral code or whatever. So it was pretty risque back then. That's that time period that I'm talking about that Tavistock was interested in studying for social control, social engineering, public opinion making, polling. One thing that Dr. Coleman talked about that's not as relevant to us nowadays because of the internet, but used to be, particularly in World War II, the boomer era, post-World War II boomer era, that polling was a big deal. But they figured out how to just make fake polls and everybody would go along with it. So just say, oh, 80% of America supports this war. You don't want to be part of the 20% of maladjusted, malicious individuals, do you? No, oh, I support it. Well, yes, whatever you say, I support it. You see. So they just made fake polls. And he says the polls are fake. They were always fake. Gallup polling comes out of this, Tavistock. And the polling is intended to engineer your perception. That's the whole purpose of it. It's nothing to do with gauging what people really thought. It was about getting you to go along with what they call groupthink. Guess who came up with groupthink? Tavistock. Groupthink is a Tavistock idea, Tavistock terminology that they came up with in regard to how to steer people into accepting total collectivization and total unanimity with certain groups. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong to have groups. That's not the point. But it's wrong to weaponize and steer people into destructive, intellectually stunting groups. But corporations love this because they love groupthink. And so it's actually corporations that would farm out and purchase a lot of this research from Tavistock. So understand, it's a research and development clinic. It's just the premier psychological warfare operation. And it's been around for so long. And this is one great example of Tavistock operations. And if you're wondering how the country went in this direction, just look at the Rand Corporation and look at Tavistock because they're in the business of steering culture. So if you want to get my books, go to jaysanalysis.com, go to the shop, get these giant, excellent 600-page books that I wrote.